Hi again. In F.F. Bruce's book, Answers to Questions, he takes up the question of, is there any evidence that Peter was ever in Rome apart from his reference to Babylon in 1 Peter 5, verse 13? Now, this is, of course, a very big question, and certainly one of the big questions of difference between Protestants and Catholics and the Orthodox community, because the question of Peter and Rome, of course, goes to the question of the authority of the Church of Rome. Bruce takes that up, but I would say in a mild and reasonable way here. He says, if that reference were the only evidence, that is 1 Peter 5:13, the case would be a precarious one. In interpreting the New Testament references to Peter and in evaluating the evidence for his career after he disappears from the New Testament record, we may not have noticed that when we were witnesses, namely that Peter disappears after Acts 15, so he goes from very prominent, the most prominent of the apostles in those early chapters, but completely missing from the latter half of the book of Acts. In evaluating the evidence for his career after he disappears from the New Testament record, it is best to put unhistorical papal claims out of our minds. There are some sturdy Protestants who suppose that their first duty towards such texts is, as thou art Peter in Matthew 16:18, or the Babylon reference in 1 Peter 5:13, is to explain them in such a way as to spike the papal guns. But the interpreter's first duty is to understand the text in the light of their context, and to avoid letting his judgment be deflected by theories or traditions which have nothing to do with the case. There is no historical evidence that Peter was the founder of the Roman Church, or that he was ever Bishop of Rome. Quite apart from the consideration that such a local charge would have been inconsistent with his apostolic commission, there is good contemporary evidence for believing that the institution of the single or monarchical bishop was not established in Rome until well into the 2nd century A.D. But that Peter did visit Rome towards the end of his life, and that he met his death there, can be supported by the same kind of evidence as John's residence in Ephesus, although the evidence is rather stronger for Peter in Rome than it is for John in Ephesus. In both cases, there is literary evidence stretching back to the 2nd century, but in Peter's case, there is a good deal of archaeological evidence too. I should not base an argument on Babylon in 1 Peter 5:13, but its identification with Rome is accepted by Eusebius in the 4th century on the authority of Papias in the 2nd century. And neither of these writers was at all interested in defending Roman claims, that is, Roman Catholic claims. I am disposed to accept the identification myself, together with the authorized version interpretation, the church that is at Babylon. That's 1 Peter 5:13. Because, it is known, and that not only from the book of Revelation, that Babylon was current as a sobriquet, or a nickname for Rome among Jews and Christians in that period. And B, there is no independent evidence for a visit by Peter to Babylon on the Euphrates. This is, by the way, the teaching of the witnesses, the Jehovah's Witnesses to this day, that Babylon in 1 Peter 5:13 is the literal city on the Euphrates River. There is no independent evidence, Bruce says, for a visit by Peter to Babylon on the Euphrates, as there is for his visiting Rome. If it be asked what the apostle to the circumcision was doing so far west, that is in Rome, it may be said that there were few cities in the world then where he could find such a concentration of his proper constituency as in Rome. Now, what's he dealing with here is the plain statement in Galatians that Paul's calling was as apostle to the Gentiles. Peter was the apostle to the circumcision. And therefore, why would Peter be in Rome? Well, as he points out here, as today, New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and other large North American cities have a very large Jewish population. So it was back then. Rome had one of the biggest Jewish populations in the world. By the way, the biggest city in Canada, Toronto, has over 200,000 Jews. So yes, it makes sense that Peter would go to serve the Jewish interests and the Jewish community, the Christian Jewish community in Rome. and the other apostles too, who were sent not to the Gentiles primarily, but to the Jews. And most Jews were not living in the Promised Land in those days, as today. I put in a link to the sixth of our series on Babylon the Great in Revelation. And the sixth one is directly on this subject. What about 1 Peter 5:13? David Berceau weighs in as to what Babylon the Great, what Babylon was, Revelation's Babylon, to the early church fathers. So in this video, there's reference to his work, David Berceau's work. And that's the sixth video, by the way, in the series. So I'll put the link to the Babylon the Great playlist that is more than 6 videos altogether, but six based on Revelation and the 12 Babylon references that are in the New Testament. See you soon.